Hi guys. Today we're going to be reading over chapter 6, and the way that I'm going to be doing today is I'm actually going to be projecting the reading on our video today, and then we're going to answer the questions together as well. I'm trying to kind of close this gap that exists between all my classes. There's a lot of confusion about what is due when, work getting done, things not being done. I have the most missing work I've ever had in my class. And so I'm trying to kind of figure out ways that we can stay ahead of this. And so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be reading this together and then we're going to be answering the questions together to kind of help condense that gap. I'm also looking into some options for you guys as well in terms of live streaming class. So a lot of you have talked about what you do when you're not here, and there's some concern that you don't realize, at least when what I'm hearing, and feel free to correct me, that when you're not here, some of you don't realize you still have work to do. All right, and it's really easy to let this kind of fall behind. But one of the big things that we agreed to when we opened up the school again was that on the 2 days that you're not here, well, the 3 days that you're not here each week, you would still be required to at least check in on your classes and or complete work. Now, I have emailed the plan this week. I have messaged you. I've posted it as material on Classroom. I have done all sorts of things to try and make sure you know what you need to do, but I'm still having a lot of missing work. Specifically, I was looking over today's questions, well, not today's questions, but the previous chapter's questions. So today we're starting chapter 6. However, what I'm noticing is a lot of people don't have chapters 2 through 5 completed, which is concerning on my end because now that puts you about 4 chapters behind. All right. And so I wanted to reach out and make sure that you know that each day you're still being asked to do work. And so I'm hoping that by changing some of the things that I'm doing here, it could help with that. And so I'm looking into some live streaming options. I'm thinking of live streaming my honors class, third period, and then also my sixth period English class, because that's my latest class in the day. And I've gathered a lot of you also have other classes that stream in the mornings. So this would help make up for some of that. And I'm looking at a few different platforms. I'm really preferential to Twitch because I use OBS to do all my recording, and OBS connects immediately to Twitch. There's also Google Classroom, Meets, and also Zoom. So I might throw out like a question today about what your preference would be in terms of like if I was to start streaming, where would you be the most interested in watching me? I'm sure some of you are like, Miss Theobald, when I'm not with you, you're good. Like I don't really want to see you, and I'm like I get it. I've got a loud voice. I'm a lot. It is what it is. Um, so let's kind of just jump into chapter 6. I'm going to switch my scene really quick for you guys so you can see kind of where we're at. So if you take a look at, right, if you take a look here with me, you're going to see the chapter on the left-hand side and your questions on the right-hand side. And so we're going to work through these together. I have chapter 6 and 7 posted here, but we're just going to work through chapter 6, which is legitimately probably just through chapter 4. All right. Or question 4, sorry. All right. You'll notice that I can mark on my reading right here. So if I want to, I might make some notes, might point out some passages to you that I think are important. But we're going to kind of just read through this together as though we were together in class, because I think that that's the best way we can make sure that the work is getting done. All right, so chapter 6 is right after Snowball has been kicked out of Animal Farm. So Napoleon is meant to represent, I believe, Lenin or Stalin, I believe Stalin specifically. And basically, eventually Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, would be kicked out of the USSR specifically. And it's unknown as to where exactly he landed. It's believed that whoever was stayed in charge of the USSR after he was removed eventually found him and killed him. But there's also ideas that he might have settled in Latin America. There's also ideas that he might have settled somewhere else. And so there's some options as well. So Snowball's gone, but he's not technically gone because we're still going to hear about him a lot. All right. So chapter 6, which is what VI is 5 and then plus 1, so that's 6. And it says this. It says all the year that year the animals worked like slaves, but they were happy in their work. They grudged no effort or sacrifice, well aware that everything they did was for the benefit of themselves and those of their kind that would come after them, and not a pack of idle thieving humans. And throughout the spring and summer, they worked a 60-hour week. So they are now working 60 hours a week. Okay, and it asks you how much work are the animals now doing. Now it's not enough to just say 60-hour a week here, my friends. You also need to include this next piece too. And then Napoleon announced that there would be work on Sunday afternoons as well, and that work was strictly voluntary. But any animal who chose not to be part of it would have his rations reduced by half. Now, I always think of this in terms of open gyms at my high school when I was growing up. So it was pretty well known that they were voluntary in the way that like this is voluntary. So you had if you had any hope of wanting to start, you'd have to make sure that you showed up at the open gyms to show you were dedicated. And that's what Napoleon's doing here is he's testing their ability towards dedication. All right. Um, so any animal that absented himself from this voluntary work would have his rations reduced by half. Okay. Um, Even so, it was found necessary to leave certain tasks undone. The harvest was a little less successful than it had been in the previous year, and the two fields, which should have been sown with roots in the early summer, were not sown because the plowing had not been completed early enough. It was possible to foresee that the coming winter would be a hard one. The windmill presented unexpected difficulties. There was a good quarry of limestone on the farm, and plenty of sand and cement had been found in one of the outhouses. So all the materials for the building were at hand. But the problem the animals could not at first solve was how to break the stones into pieces of a suitable size. There seemed no way of doing this except with picks and crowbars, which no animal could use because no animal could stand on their hind legs. Only after weeks of vain effort did the right idea occur to somebody, namely, to use the force of gravity. Huge boulders, far too big to be used as they were lying all over the bed of the quarry. The animals would lash ropes around these, and then all together the cows, horses, sheep, and any animal that could lay hold of a rope, even the pigs would sometimes join in at critical moments, would drag them with desperate slowness up the slope of the top of the quarry, where they were toppled over the edge to shatter into pieces below. Transporting the stone once broken was comparatively simple. The horses carried it off in cartloads. The sheep dragged single blocks, and even Muriel and Benjamin yoked themselves into an old governess cart, which and did their share. And by late summer, a sufficient store of stone had accumulated, and then the building began under the superintendence of the pigs. All right, so let's head to our next page. But it was a slow and laborious process. It frequently would take a whole day of exhausting effort to drag a single boulder to the top of the quarry, and sometimes when it was pushed over the edge, it would fail to break. Nothing could have been achieved without Boxer, whose strength seemed equal to that of all the rest of the animals put together. And when the boulder began to slip, it when the boulder began to slip and the animals cried out in despair at finding themselves dragged down the hill, it was always Boxer who strained himself against the rope and brought the boulder to a stop. To see him toiling up the slope inch by inch, his breath coming fast, the tips of his hoofs clawing at the ground, and his great sides matted with sweat filled everyone with admiration. Clover warned him sometimes to be careful not to overstrain himself, but Boxer would never listen. Clover warned him that warned him sometimes be, oh, da, da. And his slogans, I will work harder and Napoleon is always right, seemed to be a sufficient answer to all of his problems. He had made arrangements with the cockerel to call him 3/4 of an hour early, so 45 minutes before the start of the workday, and in the mornings instead of a half hour. And in his spare moments, of which there were not many nowadays, he would go alone into the quarry and collect a load of broken stone and drag it up the windmill to the windmill unassisted. All right. The animals were not badly off throughout the summer, though, and in spite of their hardness of work, they had no more food than they had in Jones's day. At least they did not have less. The advantage of only having to feed themselves and not to support the 5 extravagant human beings as well was so great that it would have taken a lot to outweigh it. And in many ways, the animals' method of doing things was more efficient and saved labor. Such jobs as weeding, for instance, could be done with thoroughness now impossible to be human beings. And again, since no animal now stole, it was unnecessary to fence off a pasture from arable land, which would be saved a lot of labor in the upkeeps of the hedges. Nevertheless, as the summer wore on, various unforeseen shortages began to make themselves known um, and felt. There was a need for paraffin oil, nails, string, dog biscuits, and iron for the horses' shoes, which could not be produced on the farm. Later, there would also be a need for seeds and artificial manures, besides various tools and finally the machinery for the windmill and how that would be procured, no one could imagine. On Sunday morning, when the animals assembled to receive their orders, Napoleon announced they had decided upon a new policy. From now onwards, Animal Farm would engage in trade. Okay, so one of Old Major's initial commandments was no trade. Okay, do not trade with humans. But Napoleon's going to go against that here. He's going to establish the concept of trading with other farms. Napoleon announced there would be a new policy. From now onwards, Animal Farm would engage in trade with the neighboring farms. Not, of course, for any commercial purposes, but simply in order to obtain certain materials which were urgently necessary. The needs for the windmill override everything else, he said. He was therefore making arrangements to sell a stack of hay and part of this year's wheat crop, and later on, if more money were needed, it would be made up with by the sale of eggs. Old Major also referenced this at the beginning too, if you don't remember, for which there was always a market in Willingdon. The hens, said Napoleon, should welcome this sacrifice as their own special contributions to to the building of the windmill. All right. So why does Napoleon decide to engage in trade here? He understands that the farm cannot produce everything that it needs, and so they're going to have to seek outside assistance, and that's going to be done by trading parts of certain crops throughout the farm. Um, the animals are uneasy with this, and it's the first sentence in the next paragraph. He says, once again, the animals were conscious of a vague uneasiness, never have any dealings with human beings, never to engage in trade, never to make use of money. Had these not been the earliest resolutions passed at the first triumphant meeting after Jones was expelled? All the animals remembered passing such resolutions, or at least they thought they did. The four young pigs who protested when Napoleon abolished the meetings raised their voices timidly, but they were promptly silenced by tremendous growling from dogs. So you have Napoleon now, who is always surrounded by these dogs that are very intimidating, intimidation is a way that dictators and people of power keep their subjects in line, which is what Napoleon's doing here. Um, Then, as usual, the sheep broke into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and the momentary awkwardness was smoothed over. Finally, Napoleon raised his trotter for silence and announced that he had already made all the arrangements. Um, there would be no need for any animal to come into contact with human beings, which would clearly be most undesirable. He intended to take the whole burden upon his own shoulders. Mr. Whymper, a solicitor in Willingdon, who had agreed to act as an intermediary between Animal Farm and the outside world, would visit the farm on Monday mornings and receive his instructions. Napoleon would end his speech with the cry of "Long live Animal Farm," and after the singing of Beasts of England, the animals were dismissed. Okay, so the animals, number 2a, so the second part of number 2, talks about how do the animals react to this? Well, the animals are uncomfortable with this. They were like, we remember Old Major saying we weren't supposed to engage in trade or trade money. And they're going to talk about this a little bit more. Squealer is going to show up, which, as we all know, is not always great. Afterwards, Squealer made a round of the farm and set the animals' minds at rest. He assured them that the resolution against engaging in trade and using money had never been passed or suggested. It was pure imagination, probably traceable in the beginning lies circulated by Snowball. The few animals still felt faintly doubtful, but Squealer then asked them shrewdly, "Are you certain this is not something you have dreamed, comrades? Have you any record of such a resolution?" Okay. Is it written down anywhere? So this question here that he's asking, are you certain, comrades, that this was true? Squealer is amazing. He manages to convince whole groups of animals, whole groups, that they have all had the exact same dream, and their memories are all wrong. So he's amazing in terms of like how sneaky and sly he is. All right. Is it written down anywhere? He says, and since it had certainly been true that nothing had existed in writing, the animals were satisfied that they were mistaken. So even though Old Major said not to do it, they realized that it was never written down, so the pigs are not in the wrong. All right. Every Monday, Mr. Whymper visited the farm as had been arranged. He was a sly-looking little man with side whiskers, a solicitor in a very small way of business, but sharp enough to have realized earlier than anyone else that Animal Farm would need a broker and that the commissions would be worth having. The animals watched his coming and going with a kind of dread and avoided him as much as possible. Nevertheless, the sight of Napoleon, on all fours, delivering orders to Whymper, who stood on 2 legs, roused their prize and partly reconciled this new arrangement. Their relations with the human race were not quite the same as they had been. The human beings did not hate Animal Farm any less now that it was prospering. Indeed, they actually hated it more than ever. Every human being held it as an article of faith that the farm would go bankrupt sooner or later, and above all that the windmill would be a failure. They would meet in public houses and prove to one another by means of diagrams that the windmill was bound to fall down, and if it did stand up, that it would never work, and yet against their will, They had developed a certain respect for the efficiency with which all the animals were managing their own affairs. One symptom of this was that they had begun to call Animal Farm by its proper name and had ceased to pretend to call it Manor Farm. They also dropped the championship of Mr. Jones, who had given up hopes of getting his farm back and had gone to live in another part of the country. Though Whymper, except through Whymper, there was no contact between Animal Farm and the outside world. And there was constant rumors that Napoleon was about to either enter into a definite agreement with Pilkington of Foxwood or Frederick of Pinchfield, but it was noticed never both simultaneously. This is supposed to play up the flip-flopping that the USSR did during World War II. It was about this time that the pigs suddenly moved into the farmhouse and took up their residence there. And again, the animals seemed to understand the resolution had been passed in the early days against. And again, Squealer was able to convince them that this was not the case. It was absolutely necessary, he said, that the pigs, who were the brains of the farm after all, had to have a quiet place to work. It was also more suited to the dignity of a leader, for of late they had started calling Napoleon leader, to live in a house more than a mere sty. Nevertheless, some of the animals were disturbed when they heard that the pigs had not only taken their meals in the kitchen and used the drawing room as a recreation room, but they also slept in the beds. Boxer passed it off as usual, as Napoleon is always right. But Clover, who thought she remembered a definite ruling against beds, went to the end of the farm and tried to puzzle out the 7 commandments, which were inscribed there. Finding herself unable to read more than the individual letters, she fetched Muriel. Muriel, she said, read me the 4th commandment. Doesn't it say something about never sleeping in a bed? With some difficulty, Muriel spelled it out. It says, no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets, she announced finally. Curiously enough, Clover did not remember the 4th commandment mentioning sheets, and it didn't. But as it were on the wall, must have been so. So once again, they consider their memories just bad. And Squealer, who happened to be passing by, attended by 2 or 3 dogs, was able to put the whole matter in perspective to them. You have heard then, comrades, he said, that we pigs now sleep in the beds of the farmhouse. And why not? You did not suppose surely there was ever a ruling against beds. A bed is merely a place to sleep. A pile of straw, and a straw is a bed. So he's twisting it. Properly regarded, the rule was against sheets, which are a very human invention. We have removed the sheets from the farmhouse beds and sleep between the blankets. And very comfortable beds they are too, but not more comfortable than we need, I can tell you, comrades. I have no idea how they reason out that sheets are bad, but blankets are good. Right? So it's just this page, and then I believe the next, and then like the tippy top of the next one, then we're done, okay? So just bear with me. Stay with me, my friends. So he says, you would not rob us of our repose or our break or our leisure, comrades, would you? You would not have us too tired to carry out our duties. Surely you do not wish to see Jones to come back. And that's going to be the constant threat. Anytime the animals ever challenge the pigs is they're going to threaten, well, if you don't let us do what we want, Mr. Jones is going to come back. And so they're going to constantly use this. The animals reassured him on this point immediately, and no more was said about the pigs sleeping in the farmhouse beds. And when, some days afterwards, it was announced that from now on the pigs would get up an hour later in the mornings than the other animals, no complaint was made about that either. And by autumn the animals were tired but happy. They had a hard year, but after the sale of part of the hay and corn, the stores of food for the winter were none too plentiful. But the windmill compensated for everything. It was almost half built now. And after the harvest there was a stretch of clear dry weather, and the animals toiled harder than ever, thinking it well worth now while to plod to and fro all day with blocks of stone, if by doing so they could raise the walls another foot. Boxer would even come out at nights and work for an hour or two by the light of the harvest moon, and in spare moments the animals would walk round and round the half-finished mill, admiring the strength and perpendicularity of its walls and marveling that they could have ever been able to build something so imposing. Only old Benjamin refused to grow enthusiastic about the windmill, though as usual he would utter nothing beyond a cryptic remark, the donkeys sure do live a long time. November came with a raging southwest wind, and building had to stop because it was too wet to mix the concrete. Finally, there came a night where the gale was so violent and the farmhouse buildings rocked on their foundations, and several tiles were blown off the roof of the barn. The hens woke up to squawking with terror because they had all dreamed, simultaneously, of hearing a gun go off in the distance, and in the morning the animals came out of their stalls to find the flagstaff had been blown down, and an elm tree at the foot of the orchard had been plucked up like a radish. They had just noticed this when a cry of despair broke out in every animal's throat. A terrible sight met their eyes. The windmill was in ruins. With one accord they dashed down to the spot. Napoleon, who seldom moved out of a walk, raced ahead after it with them. And yes, there it lay, the fruit of all their struggles, leveled to its foundations. The stones they had broken and carried so laboriously scattered all around. Unable at first to speak, the animals gazing mournfully at the litter of fallen stone, Napoleon paced to and fro in silence, occasionally snuffing at the ground. His tail had grown rigid and twitched sharply from side to side, a sign of intense mental activity. And suddenly he halted as though his mind was made up. Comrades, he said, do you know who's responsible for this? Do you know what enemy came in the night and overthrown our windmill? Snowball, roared the voice of thunder. Snowball has done this thing in sheer malignity, thinking to set back our plans and avenge himself for his ignominious expulsion. That traitor crept in here under the cover of night to destroy our work of nearly a year, comrades. Here and now I produce the death sentence upon Snowball, animal hero second class, and half a bushel of apples to anybody who brings him to justice. A full bushel to anybody who captures him alive. The animals were shocked beyond measure to learn that Snowball could be guilty of such an action. There was a cry of indignation, and everyone began thinking out ways of catching Snowball if he would ever come back. Almost immediately, the footprints of a pig were discovered in the grass a little distance from the knoll, and they could only be traced for a few hundred yards, but it appeared to lead to a hole in the hedge. Napoleon snuffed deeply, and announced them to be snowballs because, why not make it about Snowball? It can't just be the wind that blew this over, my friends. Oh no, it had to be something more sheerly terrible. I think this is a really good indication that Napoleon's starting to become paranoid. All right, had probably come from Foxwood Farm. No more delays, comrades, cried Napoleon when the footprints had been examined. There is work to be done. This very morning we begin rebuilding the windmill, and we will build all through the winter, rain or shine. We will teach this miserable traitor he cannot undo our work so easily. Remember, comrades, there must be no alteration in our plans. They shall carry out to the day. Forward, comrades. Long live the windmill. Long live Animal Farm. All right, so the windmill is destroyed probably by a gust of wind, although I think it would take quite a gust of wind to knock over a cemented stone piece. If you can think of anything else, let me know. They use it as a way to blame Snowball for being a bad guy. They're starting to create the villain narrative for Snowball here, and that's something that you need to be aware of as well. Snowball's going to get blamed for a heck of a lot for somebody who may not be even alive. Why does Napoleon insist the windmill must be rebuilt immediately? He doesn't want, first of all, he doesn't want the animals to lose hope here. Okay, he knows that this is a huge blow to their morale, and so he's trying to kind of change that here. Also, he's got plans that he doesn't want to see thrown off, and so he's going to continue pushing them to build this windmill, even though it's going to take like all of their effort and all of their focus. All right, so that is going to be the end of chapter 6. So please make sure that you update your questions and get those done. I've covered them all in this. So if you've watched till the end, just so you know, you have all the work done. All right. So if you have any questions at all, let me know. I'm happy to help, and have a great day, and I'll see you guys later.